Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome. Today's topic is John Adams, Part 6. We're going to wrap up the life of John Adams today, the second President of the United States. We stopped last time in 1813. His daughter, Nabby, had died of breast cancer at a relatively young age. And earlier, his son Charles had died of alcoholism. He'd been defeated for the presidency. He was in his retirement at home at Peace Field, renamed Monticello, Quincy, Massachusetts. He wrote this in 1813 after the death of his daughter, quote, "Grief sharpens the understanding and softens the heart. The furrows depicted in the portraits and statues of great men were all plowed in the countenance by grief." The War of 1812 was ongoing. By this time, was up until 1814, and he wrote this about the War of 1812, quote, It is the decree of Providence, as I believe, that this nation must be purified in the furnace of affliction." Now, in that war, the U.S. Navy performed very well. And remember, John Adams had founded the United States Navy. When the peace treaty was signed, his son, John Quincy Adams, was one of the signers, one of the very important people involved in that, ending the War of 1812. In 1815, Adams wrote this, quote, "The American Revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effected from 1760 to 1775, in the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was drawn at Lexington." So he's talking about the importance of the mind and thinking, that the revolution was involved a way of thinking, that Americans started thinking of themselves as Americans, not as Englishmen, and that they were tired of the way they were being treated, and there was a desire for independence. That same year, Adams wrote this, quote, 36 years I rode over a great part of the Asturian and Pyrenean mountains in Spain on a beautiful mule, and I would give more for that little animal for any use now than for the best horse at the New Market races." Now, what he was talking about here is he was elderly. He was having trouble getting on a horse and riding a horse. And mules are shorter and easier to mount. Now, when his son, John Quincy, was negotiating the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812, John wrote him a letter from father to son, quote, "My advice to you is to study Epictetus in Greek, as I did more than 50 years ago. My son, you must be cool, candid, and respectfully candid with those Britons. They seem not to be sensible that if they drive us to extremities, which they cannot, we should meet the friendship of their enemies over the whole globe, and whatever they may think, they have enemies enough." In 1816, Adams wrote this, quote, "The doctrine of human equality is founded entirely in the Christian doctrine that we are all children of the same Father, all accountable to him for our conduct to one another, all equally bound to respect each other's self-love." Yeah, this is a fascinating point because the issue of equality. Why should people have equal rights before the law? Some people think, there's an idea of superiority. Well, we're superior, maybe ethnic groups or religions or whatever, a sense of superiority, and others are inferior. And see, this point is very important because he's saying that we're all children of God. Every human being was created by God and therefore deserves respect and equality before the law and equality of opportunity. Abigail wrote a letter to their son John Quincy in 1860, and she said this, quote, "Your father's zeal for books will be one of the last desires which will quit him." As Adams got older, he was having trouble with his eyes. He was having trouble reading. Eventually, he couldn't read anymore, but he had others. He had people who would read to him. Also in 1816, Adams wrote this, quote, "The Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount contain my religion." In 1817, his son John Quincy and his wife Louisa and their 3 children came home to the United States after 8 years in Europe. And John Quincy had been the U.S. ambassador over there. He'd been in Russia, he'd been in France, and he'd been negotiating. He'd actually been in Prussia for a while. And he came home, and he served as the Secretary of State for U.S. President James Monroe. In 1818, on October 28th, Abigail died. His wife died, and this was very tough, very, very hard. The death. In fact, he never thought it would happen. He thought he would die first. So, and at her funeral, the governor of Massachusetts and the president of Harvard were pallbearers, paying their respects to her and to him. They see how respected both John and Abigail were in Massachusetts. She had died of typhoid fever. They'd been married for 54 years. And Adams wrote this, quote, "I wish I could lie down beside her and die too." So this is very, very tough. They were very close, very good friends, had a very good marriage. And as he got older, he wrote this letter to his granddaughter, Caroline, quote, "The longer I live, the more I read, the more patiently I think, and the more anxiously I inquire, the less I seem to know. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly. This is enough." That's what they say. Is some people say the more they learn, the more they realize, the more they know, the more they realize they don't know. In 1818, Adams wrote this, quote, "There is nothing to try men's souls, nor to excite men's souls, but agriculture. And I say, God speed the plow and prosper stone wall." Yeah, so he was enjoying the simple pleasures. He had this farm, and he was out working as much as he could. As he got older, he'd be out helping in the fields, helping with the crops. His son Thomas moved in and was helping take care of him in his final years. Unfortunately, Thomas was also drinking himself to death. So this was very hard. He'd already lost one son, and he got to watch his another son, who was trying to take care of him, who himself really needed help, and didn't get it because alcoholics didn't get help back then. 1820, Adams wrote this, quote, "We must settle the question of slavery's extension now. Otherwise, it will stamp our national character and lay a foundation for calamities, if not disunion." He's talking about the problem. Slavery was a growing divisive issue in our country, and we were headed toward the Civil War. Because it violated the whole idea of all men are created equal. More and more people were ashamed of slavery. They thought, this is wrong. This is terrible. What are we doing? What kind of a country are we? We talk about freedom, and we have slaves. It's hypocrisy. Thomas Jefferson wrote one of the letters. Remember, they were writing to each other, these very affectionate, friendly letters. After their friendship was restored, they'd become estranged because of their political conflict. In 1820, Jefferson wrote to Adams, quote, "I am sure that I really know many, many things, and none more surely than that I love you with all my heart, and pray for the continuance of your life until you shall be tired of it yourself." Isn't that wonderful? He talked about how one of the things he really knew is that he loved John Adams. So it's wonderful that people can reconcile, because they had been very good friends over in Europe. They'd spent a lot of time together. In 1820, Massachusetts had a constitutional convention to revise their constitution, and Adams was invited to participate. And he only came for a few sessions because he was running out of gas. He was an old man, and he didn't have the strength really to help. In 1821, Adams wrote this, quote, "Slavery in this country I have seen hanging over it like a black cloud for half a century." Again, the issue of slavery. This was haunting Americans and really led to the Civil War. And I think today we're still having the issue of slavery, the legacy of slavery, and how it affected African Americans. 1821, Adams wrote this, quote, "I am too feeble and have been confined to the house the greatest part of the winter, but I hope to crawl out like a turtle in spring." I thought that was very, very well written, because I think turtles tend to hibernate in the winter. Excuse me. In 1822, Adams wrote this, quote, "Death is not an evil. It is a blessing to an individual and to the world. Yet we ought not to wish for it, till life becomes insupportable. We must wait the pleasure and convenience of this great teacher. And he was, in 1822, he wrote about political differences. Remember, politics always has this conflict up till now. People take very strong positions, and and he wrote this, that despite political differences, quote, the first want of man is his dinner, and the second his girl, held in common by every Democrat and aristocrat. So that same year he wrote this, quote, our country is or ought to be happy. If ever there existed upon this globe a nation of people who had so many causes and motives for thanksgiving as our American nation, it has never fallen under my observation or reading. The following year, in 1823, Adams wrote this, quote, when I was running the gauntlet as a public figure, I refused to suffer in silence. I sighed, sobbed, and groaned, and sometimes screeched and screamed. And I must confess to my shame and sorrow that I sometimes swore. That same year he recalled how he confounded the Turkish ambassador when they were meeting by blowing smoke rings during their get-together. That same year, Adams met an elderly woman that he'd known as a youth, and he was joking around with her. He said, quote, what, madam, shall we not go walk in Cupid's grove together? Cupid would be the god of love, and this woman was a little bit embarrassed, but she was able to make a comeback, and she responded saying, ah, sir, it would not be the first time we walked together. In 1824, John Quincy, his son, was elected the 6th president of the United States. So this is really something. He had a son who was elected president. And he congratulated him, and he wrote to John Quincy, quote, no man who ever held the office of president would congratulate a friend on obtaining it. He actually had mixed feelings. He knew how tough the presidency was. But he was also proud of his son, very proud, and he wrote this in 1825, quote, the multitude of my thoughts and the intensity of my feelings are too much for a mind like mine in its 90th year. May the blessing of God Almighty continue to protect you to the end of your life, as it has heretofore protected you in so remarkable a manner from your cradle. Actually, John Quincy was also a one-term president. He had really had trouble. In fact, in a sense, he should not have been elected that year because Andrew Jackson received more votes. And then it was only Henry Clay actually gave his votes, which gave Adams more. Anyway, so he had that in common with his father. They're both one-term presidents. But John Quincy went on, did an awful lot of good in the following years to the end of his life. Fighting slavery. He was one of the greatest champions fighting slavery. In 1825, John Adams wrote this, quote, I look back with rapture to those golden days when Virginia and Massachusetts lived and acted together like a band of brothers. So he's referring to the growing conflict of slavery because, Virginia and Massachusetts were the two most important states in the Revolution. Because it started in Massachusetts Rebellion, and then Virginia contributed Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration, George Washington, who led, and actually Virginia had the most money. But by this time, there was this growing conflict over slavery, and Virginia really was the center of slavery, and Massachusetts became the center of the abolition movement. So he was feeling kind of sad about this growing conflict, which led to the Civil War. Now, Adams wanted to remain alive until the 50th anniversary. It was coming up. July 4th, 1826 was the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And on June 30th, a Quincy civic delegation came to visit him. He wasn't going out anymore. And they asked him to make a toast for the Jubilee of Independence. Adams responded, quote, "Independence forever." And they said, "Nothing more?" And he said, "Not a word." Actually, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson used their willpower to stay alive until July 4th, 1826. And they both died that same day. Adams, one of the last things that Adams said was, "It is a good day. It is a great day." And his last words were, Thomas Jefferson survives. But actually, Jefferson had died a few hours earlier. So this was really something that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, they both died on July 4th, 1826, 50th anniversary of our of the Independence Day. And for many people, this was proof from on high that, to quote Daniel Webster, quote, that our country and its benefactors are objects of his care. In other words, of God's care. And people really believe this wasn't a coincidence. You know, that they had these political differences, and we need to overcome them. And they had. They'd resumed their friendship. And then they believed there was a common image that the two men, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, hand in hand, ascended into heaven. You know, this is really something. Yeah, that really struck people. That they were both patriots. Yeah, they disagreed. They had their differences, but they were both wonderful men who contributed so much to our country. John Adams was buried at the United First Parish Church in Quincy, Massachusetts. Here's another quote by John Adams. Quote, "What is to become of an independent statesman, one who will bow the knee to no idol, who will worship nothing as a divinity but truth, virtue, and his country? I will tell you, he will be regarded more by posterity than those who worship hounds and horses. And although he will not make his own fortune, he will make the fortune of his country." He's talking about selfless service, so important for any country, for the world. He said this at another time, quote, "Politics are the divine science after all. How is it possible that any man should ever think of making it subservient to his own little passions and mean private interests? Ye base-born sons of fallen Adam, is the end of politics a fortune, a family, a gilded coach, a train of horses, and a troop of livery servants, balls at court, splendid dinners and suppers? Yet the divine science of politics is at length in Europe reduced to a mechanical system composed of these materials." He's arguing against corruption. People shouldn't go into government to try to make a lot of money. That's wrong. It should be selfless service. And then he wrote this another time, quote, "The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, and that there is not a force of law and public justice to protect it, anarchy and tyranny commence. Property must be secured, or liberty cannot exist." Another time Adams wrote this, quote, "I always consider the settlement of America with reverence and wonder, as the opening of a grand scene, and design in providence for the illumination of the ignorant and the emancipation of the slavish part of mankind all over the earth." Adams wrote again, another time, quote, "The people in America have now the best opportunity and the greatest trust in their hands that Providence ever committed to so small a number." Another time Adams wrote this, quote, "He who loves the workman," that's capital W, "and his work, and does what he can to preserve and improve it, shall be accepted of him." Another time he wrote, quote, "Griefs upon griefs, disappointments upon disappointments. What then? This is a gay, merry world notwithstanding." Another time he wrote this, quote, "This phrase, 'Rejoice evermore,' shall never be out of my heart, memory, or mouth again as long as I live, if I can help it." Yeah, so this is he fought depression. This is important. Well, you have to listen to the gosh darn telephone here, answering machine. It's very, very irritating. Well, what are you gonna do, right? And anyway, so you can see he fought depression. He was fighting to stay positive. Rejoice evermore. No matter what happens, I think it's a wonderful idea. No matter what happens, let's be happy. And with God's help, we can. In recent years, this David McCullough wrote the latest popular biography of Adams, which I think was so wonderful. And he wrote this about John Adams, quote, "A great-hearted, persevering man of uncommon ability and force. He had a brilliant mind. He was honest, and everyone knew it. Emphatically independent by nature, hard-working, frugal, all traits in the New England tradition. He was anything but cold or laconic, as supposedly New Englanders were, ambitious to excel, to make himself known, he had nonetheless recognized at an early age that happiness came not from fame or fortune, but from an habitual contempt of them, as he wrote. Yeah, this wonderful biography by David McCullough, along with this mini-series with Paul Giamatti. For this talk, for these 6 talks I've given, I read 5 books. The first, John Adams by David McCullough in 2001. The Passionate Sage by Joseph Ellis, 1983. John Adams' Party of One by James Grant, 2005. Founding Brothers by Joseph Ellis, 2000. And John Adams, A Life by John Ferling, 1992. So, in conclusion, John Adams is a forgotten hero. We should remember him. He was the man more than anyone that believed in our country, believed that we could be a country. Instead of 13 British colonies, we could be a country. And we needed to fight a war of independence for our freedom. He believed we could win. And we did win. And morale is so important. So he was a big believer in our country, and he promoted the American Revolution to the point that most people thought, yes, you're right, let's fight a war of independence and against Great Britain so we can control our own fate. And then he went to Europe, and he did a lot of good work trying to get French support in the war, French naval support, getting loans from the Netherlands. And then he came home and served loyally as vice president. And as president himself, he did the right thing. And when the public wanted war with France, he kept the peace. Although he built the U.S. Navy because he believed in peace through strength. And then as a young man, of course, he had defended the British soldiers in the Boston Massacre trial because he believed it was the right thing to do, even though the public was against him. The public was anti-British, but he believed that these men deserved a fair trial. And actually, they were threatened by the crowd. But John Adams was a wonderful man, a very good man, and he served his country, did a good job. He was a good person, and he's a forgotten hero. He should be remembered, John Adams. God bless John Adams, a man who served his country well. Next time we'll talk about Thomas Jefferson, the 3rd president of the United States. And until then, God bless you. Hope you find a good history book to read. I think history is important, and we need to pay our respects to the people who lived in the past, who contributed, who built this world, who built our country, built the United States. And John Adams certainly played a very important role in that. And so I hope you develop a love of history because it's so interesting. So many amazing history books to read that are out there. I have so much respect for all the historians and all the authors of history books, all the work they do, on a topic. And so anyway, I hope you find a good history book to read. I hope you develop an interest in history. God bless you. May the road rise to meet you. May the wind be at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face and rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. Live long and prosper. May the force be with you. God bless you. God bless America, the Philippines, and the whole world. See you next time.